Good deal. It looks like we're live. Well, I thank everyone for coming today, and I thank to Megan and Torrance Learning for inviting us here today. We have quite a few ADL alumni in this meeting, so it's kind of exciting to see old and new faces. I've really enjoyed the conversations that have been going on about xAPI profiles. That's such an important part of what we're doing here today. And I have one profile in particular that I want to talk to you all about here, but it's kind of all in the context of the strategy behind how we're trying to build upon all of the good work that people before us have done with xAPI, and kind of, paving the way to really create this enterprise strategy across the Department of Defense. Let me see. This is what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about the DOD Data Strategy that's kind of driving the overarching umbrella of a lot of the work that we're doing here. We'll talk a little bit about the specific modernization efforts on some of the things that we're doing to implement everything we're going to talk about here. We'll talk a little bit about the TLA data interoperability standards. These are all IEEE standards that form the core of these things. But the reason this is important is because this does talk to the totality of training and education data. I shouldn't say the totality. Each of these is buckets, and there's a whole lot of other types of data that are important inside of these things, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, we'll finish it up with a little bit of a discussion about this work that we're doing here right now to operationalize a lot of this. It's something called the DOD Learning Enclave. This is a program that's being run underneath the DOD's Enterprise Digital Learning Modernization, EDLM initiative. And it's got a lot of senior leader buy-in, a lot of good things going on with that. So many of you are already familiar with the ADL initiative, I'm sure of that. But you may not be aware that we've been reorged. We used to kind of report underneath, over here on the right, you'll see the DASD, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Education and Training. We used to report up to that office. About a year, well, maybe not even a year ago, 8 months ago or something, we were officially realigned to be supporting the Defense Human Resource activity. And so we still sit underneath Personnel and Readiness, and we have a reporting line over to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness, of which the FE&T office reports to. So we've moved over for our direct line reports, and then we've kind of leapfrogged where we were before. And we have a really good relationship with the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness. And we're working very closely with the Force Education and Training Office. We have just been going back and forth. They're creating a data management charter that's very much aligned with the TLA standards that we'll talk about here today. So I just thought I'd point that out. I think that's pretty nifty, especially in the sense that we're talking about how xAPI can be used across human capital management systems. A lot of this falls underneath the DOD's data strategy. And so here's a few documents here that just talk about it. There are a host of other documents. I decided not to give too much front matter to this. If you just do a search, you'll find a ton of information out there. This is where it gets kind of fun, though. So they have this graphic in one of their strategy documents. I think it is actually the DOD Data Strategy. And we have been working with them quite a bit. As a matter of fact, every Thursday night, I sit with the Chief Data Officer's engineering team, and we have been going through our TLA. It's like been defending a thesis for about the past 8 months. We've gone through every data model, every nuance of the architecture, every nuance of the data management tools that we're trying to put into place here. And it really does, there seems to be a good fit. The results of that have been that the Mr. Spurk, the DOD Chief Data Officer, has signed a memo and sent it out to everyone and stated that he's designated ADL as a Pathfinder organization. And what does that really mean? Well, it means that we're doing things that they think is along the right way to do things for DOD. They've kind of off the cuff said that our TLA is about 5 to 7 years ahead of the rest of the department, and that this is where we need to go. So a lot of the data management tools that we had started building as prototypes are being operationalized and implemented into an IL4 environment right now. Some of those are sitting out in public, and they'll be federated so that they can go from the public and then feed one way up into behind the firewall. And that might be important for enterprise organizations or industries that want to leverage the public available profiles and the resources, but then they need to protect some of those as well. And so we're hopeful that a lot of the things that we're building are still very much of interest to the industry and academic base that we serve. A particular note here, I think the CDO folks often talk about this as these 8 guiding principles. And this kind of makes sense, right? This is very similar to some of the data decrees that was put out by the Deputy Secretary of Defense for visible, accessible, understandable data and whatnot. But I would point out that this inner ring here that talks about architecture, standards, governance, and talent and culture, that is the ADL sweet spot. This is where we're really working to build out the total learning architecture based on IEEE standards. We're working hard to put in the governance strategy across the department to help make sure that we are keeping up with the times. One thing that's certain has changed. We know that the data models and the requirements and new tools and technologies are going to come into play, and we need to be constantly evolving the way that we're describing and tracking this data. So that's all important. Arguably, the most important part of this is the talent and culture. I am not worried about the tech at all. Matter of fact, I'm pretty comfortable with where we're going from a tech perspective and getting things to talk to each other. But the talent and culture is a whole different ballgame. There's a lot of change management that needs to go in there. There's a lot of upskilling that's going to be required. There's whole new fields that we've talked about in the field of learning engineering. When is the right time to pick out your xAPI profiles or to build your competency frameworks, or how do you best describe your learning resources in your organization? And so I expect that there's going to be a lot more effort and outreach and trying to build up this community so that we do have a skilled workforce that can start to work with these next generation of standards. I think that's it for that slide. So full confession, stole this slide. I was doing a tutorial with Confluent looking at these data connectors for pulling data out of relational databases into Neo4j. And this is something that they showed here. So I kind of paused it on that video and then recreated this in PowerPoint by hand. It's my PowerPoint art, so I'm kind of proud of it. But doesn't this kind of paint the picture of what the current landscape of training and education is? You have all these data repositories where all your learner data sits. I think that rings true for every one of us on the meeting right now. I know my own personal history. I have learner data all over the place. Different universities, different schools, certainly all the annual training requirements we have within the Department of Defense. Not to mention the webinars and the conferences that I've attended or presented at, the paper sessions that I've gone to, the certificates that I've, the courses that I've gone through. And all of that is invaluable when you think about the totality of lifelong learning. You can just learn a lot from that. Right now, what do? We have it in these stovepipes and it kind of sits there. That's no bueno. This is what we want to move over towards. We want to kind of move towards this event streaming mindset where we still have the data ownership and stewardship by all the system owners, but that we can share this data and we can stream it so that any other system can start to make use of this data. And so we'll get deeper into this. This is just kind of the high level, marketing spiel of here's what we want to move towards. Here's our roadmap. But it doesn't really mean much if you're just looking at it. But this is kind of what we're trying to look for. We want, this application over here on the left to be able to leverage all the other data that's generated by all these other applications to ultimately tailor the learning experience for Andy or for Megan or for Judy, depending on their learner profile and what they've already learned throughout the course of their career or eventually throughout their lifelong learning continuum. Not trivial. It's been a goal, stretch goal. So the TLA is the program of record that we're moving forward with. It's started back in 2016. There's a lot of data out there already about it. I remember sitting down for lunch with Jason Haig at one point in time, and we were talking about, well, what is this TLA? And I'm like, well, it's kind of like a data strategy. We just have all these buckets of data, and we're trying to quantify it and put it all together and whatnot. He goes, well, why don't you call it that? It's kind of like one of those blinding flashes of the obvious. It's like, yeah, why don't we call it that? And so we did. We started kind of rebranding it and saying, yeah, it's a data strategy. And I think that's helped us a lot in trying to communicate what the TLA is. So many times people come up to us and say, we want a TLA, and they think it's a thing. Where are the tools? Well, we have a reference implementation. It's all open source. You can go to the ADL website and the ADL GitHub and download all of the tools that we currently use here. But we hope that that is just the start, right? We hope that industry are going to start adopting these standards into their solutions. We hope that learning management systems and learning experience platforms and mobile learning applications and other folks in that ecosystem of learning activities, and ultimately that ecosystem of human capital management systems start to implement these capabilities, so that it's not just us building out our little prototypes and saying, here, government people, use this. We want industry to pick this up and start running with it, because we know that they have budgets a lot bigger than ours, and that's the kind of innovation that we need. And that actually hopefully creates this even playing field across large and small businesses, because here's all the data you can work from. So what's your special sauce? Why is your adaptive learning algorithm better than my learning algorithm? So even the playing field from the perspective of breaking down the barriers to entry for different organizations to get into adaptive instructional systems, but also sets the stage for differentiators and for really pushing the envelope. Governance is very important for all of this, because as people are generating new data across different adaptive systems, we're going to find some commonality. And those are things that might make sense that, hey, you know what, everybody seems to need that. We should include that in the learner profile. So we'll see where it goes. And we're going to see where it goes in a large way right now. If I can find my mouse, where is my mouse? There we go. If you're interested in other information about the TLA, this is not a presentation to sell the value of the TLA. We've got a lot of information about that up there already that you can go in and look at about why the TLA is important. And quite frankly, we've already sold this across the DOD, and now we're in the implementation phase. And so we're knee deep in building. I always kind of joke around and say, coming from the RD&E community, I'm always happy to talk about how do you transition my project. For the ADL initiative, we've kind of had this odd thing where they don't want to just transition our project. They want to transition our entire portfolio. I've had senior leaders ask me, are we going to have these things accredited by the end of the year? This was like in July. I'm like, nope. But we are working towards that goal. And I suspect that spring, summer, we're going to start having things running there in the IL4 environment with certificates to field. We have a whole ecosystem vision for how to make this accessible to the rest of the department. And it's really important that we work with the community and you all and others to be able to get your wares into this learning technology warehouse that we'll talk about here shortly. Not to say that that's the only way that things will get acquired, but it will certainly make it easier for folks. I guess I didn't include that slide in there. No, I did. Why is it? Oh, here it is. So this is the 4-pillar data strategy. We talk about being standards-based. Everyone here is familiar with xAPI. Many of you may be familiar with shareable competency definitions. Certainly the IEEE's P2881 standard for learning metadata and the P2997 standard for enterprise learner records. We'll talk about these in a little bit more depth. Back in 2019, we did put out a 2019 TLA report. And in one of our appendices was a DOTA, the DOD architectural framework. And so this is the Div 2 from that drawing. And I just wanted you to see that in the upper right-hand corner here, we talk about these 4 types of standards, these 4 types of data. So this whole concept of a 4-pillar data strategy has been what we've been working at all along. The conversation with Jason was just kind of that common sense of, why don't you call it that? I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. So I'm going to give him full credit for that. The other thing that we are not going to talk about a whole lot today is this conformance suite. We need to have conformance testing for a lot of these different standards, and we're going to continue to build that out and blow that out. I think that's where many discussions are going to be held about, how do we do that from an enterprise perspective for DoD? Back in the day, we had that SCORM, conformance test suite. Now we have an xAPI conformance test suite, but it's really only applicable to learner record stores. Where I think it becomes important is when we start thinking about profiles and the adoption of different profiles. So how do we ensure that Pebble is conformant to the Pebble profile, or someone else's Pebble book is conformant to the Pebble profile? And so we have some ideas about how you can load in the profiles and how you can do the conformance testing against those profiles. I think we're going to have to really start to evaluate that deeper. We did just release a CMI5 conformance test suite, and I'm sure that'll be talked about at some point as well. So what is the TLA? We talk about the TLA in the context of core and edge systems. And so when I think of the TLA, I'm usually talking about the core. And that's essentially where all the data sits. So many of these standards are still in development, but we've got xAPI. I think you all know that a lot better than I do. But building on the value of the work that everybody has done with ADL or with xAPI, we've taken some of those lessons learned and really started branching out. And so you'll see that they're all connected. We also have the P2997 standard for enterprise learner records. I kind of already mentioned that, P2881, and then the shareable competency definitions. What I really like about xAPI is that it has this server-side implementation. And so you have the xAPI statements, and then you have the learner record store. And we took that and we replicated it in our architecture. And so for P2881, you might have an experience index. That might drive your local course catalog. We're currently integrating our enterprise course catalog with Joint Knowledge Online, DAU's iCatalog, some Navy catalogs, some Air Force catalogs, and all of them are just pushing straight to the global, but they're also all interested in being able to set up and manage their own local course catalogs at times. So this becomes a local data store that gets federated up to this global, this down here. You'll see that in a minute. Same thing with competencies. Competency registries is really important for competencies, for them to be pushed to the edge. And in the military, we have something we call task conditions and standards. And for many of the things that are being assessed, you have to assess them in the context of the mission. And so I use marksmanship as an example sometimes. You're going to have a lot of different ways to evaluate a soldier on their marksmanship skills. You're going to do it one way if you're at the Marine Corps' Winter Warfare Center. You're going to do it a different way if you're in a urban environment, doing Army training. And it might be completely different if you're doing it for special operators or sniper school or some of these higher level things. But they're all marksmanship competencies, right? So they're all like the same competency. They're just different focus areas, different rubrics for how you're going to assess for those different task conditions and standards. And so the alignment tools to be able to bring in multiple competency frameworks that someone has already been assessed for and be able to align those so that you can find out what's similar. Here's all the training I've already had. Here's the training my organization requires. Wow, you only need about a week of training instead of 16 weeks. So it's just trying to, knowledge is power and trying to make a more informed workforce, but also, trying to reduce the amount of time that we do duplicate or redundant training and whatnot. So that all gets summed up into this whole concept of the TLA core. Remember, TLA core equals data. And then everything else that's either using the data or generating the data or both is an edge system. And so in the old days, I think we talked about the learning management system was this just one big, homunculus system that managed learner state, managed the delivery of the courses, managed everything. We've now pushed that learning management system to the edge. And what we've essentially done, if you think about the different standards that we have inside of here, we've taken all the data that used to reside inside of a learning management system, and we've turned it into an enterprise resource. That's essentially what we've done. And now, from that perspective, a learning management system, a learning experience platform, Pebble, just about any learning activity is an edge system that's going to push xAPI statements into our core. And we'll talk a little bit about how we do that. But it's also other systems. It's your dashboards, your analytics, it's schedulers and recommenders and portals. They're all going to be using the TLA core data. And then down here in the bottom, these are some of the things that are currently being built through the DOD Learning Enclave work. And these are what I kind of hearken to the data management tools that are going to help make this data shareable and accessible to the rest of DOD so that everybody can kind of have that common operating picture about the learners that are inside their organization. So the first type of data is xAPI. I'm not going to go too deep on this because I feel like I could probably get a PhD by sitting and listening to the experts in this call. What I will say is that with profiles, we have our own particular profile. And so we call this the TLA Master Object Model. It's up on the xAPI profile server. And it's essentially the contract for how different systems connect to the TLA core. Not just a learning activity, but the whole human capital management system. I expect that there will be other systems that we're going to have to create MOM profiles for at some point in time. You'll notice, excuse me, that we talk about this concept of a noisy LRS. And back in these other slides, we talked about this transactional and authoritative LRS. So we do use a federated LRS structure. The transactional is the first one that you come to inside of the TLA core. The noisy sits outside the core. It's important. It's really important because we want to know where all that raw learner data is stored. If you think of hooking an xAPI into a simulator system, you might collect every button push and knob turn and trigger pull. You don't necessarily need to have all that information sent over the network up so that every system has insights into all that data. There's data ownership, there's bandwidth issues, there's a whole bunch of reasons why you should have this federated approach. The noisy LRS stores all of that information. It's invaluable to the instructor, so for automated instructor support tools or for intelligent tutoring applications. Other systems can use that data to refactor and optimize the learner's experience inside of that particular learning activity. But once you think a little bit broader and think about outside of that learning activity, we also want to understand who's scheduling, who's attempting, who's going through. And so that's what these verbs are here for the learning activity state. This is very similar to CMI 5. I think we have a couple extra in here. And we've talked to a lot of different folks about this, both in industry, LMS vendors, and others to try to fine tune this. It's like a lot of things. I think this is a good starting point. This is our second or third version of the MOM. But we're going to continue to hone in and get better and do what the community needs. And that's one of the values of the profile server, is that we can all sign up for this and start to think about how do we govern, how do we keep this going. But we have different MOM or different portions of the MOM profile, I guess you could call it, that impact different types of systems that you might use across the human capital supply chain. So if you're doing career field management tools and you're a career counselor, you're going to want to know what jobs have they had, and are they eligible for a promotion? Are they have they been deployed? And so these are some of the verbs that are typical inside of the career field management world. I know that there was some conversations in the last meeting about some of the HR open standards, and I know Florian's been working with that group a little bit to help build out some profiles and get that. And so we want to get smarter on that too. I suspect that those will do a lot to inform what the MOM is. But if you take one thing away from this, the master object model is really the connective tissue that links all of these different TLA data types together. And so for a learning activity, you'll see here on the left that we're going to use an actor. Well, that's no news to anybody, but what we're doing inside of the DOD is we're going to be initially using the DOD ID. It's a 16-digit PIV number that every DOD person has, whether they're in uniform, or in the civilian workforce, or a DOD contractor. And all of that training can be tracked via that DOD ID. There are some other initiatives going on in the department that are much broader thinking, that will have a different unique identifier that we may end up migrating to. So we'll see how that goes out. But in the near term, this is pretty much commonplace. A lot of the folks are doing that. The verbs we just talked about here, and we have our starting set of verbs that you would collect inside of your transactional LRS. But then for activities, the payload, right? The objects will be a little bit different, maybe depending on each of these that are connecting here. But for an activity, we want to know that Andy completed, whatever the course ID is. And once we know what the course has been completed, this becomes a pointer to the learning activity metadata that we've collected on that. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about learning activity metadata. So the P2881 standard for learning metadata has been going on now for some time, and we created a draft. It was a draft for our enterprise course catalog. And so we were a little bit ahead of where the P2881 group was. We handed that draft over to the P2881 group. And Andy can talk more about how much of it they took and how much they kind of left on the table. And we have learned from them as well quite a bit. When we went in, we created this homunculus giant spreadsheet of attributes and tried to categorize them and group them. And working with them, we've learned, well, really the trend in standards is to think about it as core and profiles. And so we've taken that to heart. When P2881 started, it was really focused on updating MOM, the learner object metadata that was formerly a part of the SCORM specifications. But we did things to improve the granularity of the data you're able to collect. So for technical requirements, we're pretty happy with that. We worked with the Army's synthetic training environment team to look at, here's all the data that you collect outside of xAPI. For a simulator, you might have a video-based after action review system, or you might have biometric sensors or other types of sensors that are beyond xAPI. And so this metadata standard has endpoints for all the different types of data that you might have inside of a single exercise. We increased the granularity for how we're describing the educational information, what used to be called educational information inside of a MOM. We took things like courses. So if you think about when you finish a course inside of a learning management system, oftentimes, I can't speak in absolutes, but oftentimes Florian gets credit for finishing a course. And you have some information about that course. What we did is we took and we created something called course sections. And I don't think that we can take credit for that. I want to believe that that's part of like the learning opportunity type with Credential Engine or some other standard that was out there. What we did is we looked at all the other standards and said, hey, that's a good idea. We want to do something like that. So we broke courses down in the course section. So now when you go through a course, if you choose to, you can add, hey, this course has 6 lessons and 6 knowledge checks. And lesson 1 is aligned to these competencies or ELOs, TLOs, or KSA matrices, or whatever your rubric du jour is. And then lesson 2 and 3 and so on and so forth. But by knowing this, you can get a lot of good forensics information on the learning experience. You can see that, well, Brent went through lessons 1, 2, 3, and 4, but he really screwed the pooch on lesson 5. He did okay on 6 too, but we need to do some remediation on 5. I don't have to go in and take the whole course. I can just go back and take that module. Alternatively, if everybody's doing bad in lesson 5, maybe we think about rewickering that whole module, right? So there's goodness in that. But then when we think bigger picture and we start moving into this competency-based learning mindset, where I should only have to go do the training that I need. If my learner record suggests that, hey, he's already pretty proficient in lessons 1, 2, 3, and 4, let's just pop him in at lesson 5, you go in and take it, and you'll be good to go. Now I know that I can just show up for maybe 2 weeks of TDY versus 16 weeks. And this is already being used. edX is a big MOOC that's out there, and they're actually, they do a lot of custom work and I don't know all the details, but they're working with other industry partners who, I guess, license their courses or whatnot. And just anecdotally, one of the challenges that they had, and I think they have with a lot of these MOOCs, is that they have really bad completion rates. People start the course and then people aren't finishing them, and everybody's like, well, why? That's horrible. These must be horrible courses because nobody's finishing them. But by kind of increasing the granularity for how they're tracking and describing the content, they're able to go in and look and see what people are actually doing. And they kind of have this bell curve, and it shows that people are kind of skipping the introduction. They're ramping up the speed to like 1.75, and then they're going through these core modules, and then they're not really doing the assessments and the wrap-ups. And so with a lot of the technical courses, for example, a lot of the engineers are just going in, getting what they need to do their job. They're using these courses more as performance support or performance enhancement or just-in-time training than they are worried about getting a certificate or a completion or anything else. And once they're able to show that to their partners, once the edX team was able to show that to their partners, there's a lot of head nods. They understood the value of what they're doing there. And so I was pretty excited to hear that. I reported that to my bosses because that made them very happy. This is a big eye chart. There will be a test on this later. This is what we originally created, the tabular data, that big spreadsheet that we kind of looked at creating this. Every one of these data elements is aligned to where did we get it from, what is the source of it and whatnot. It's a real pain to look through this in a spreadsheet format. So what we've been doing is we've been working to put it into a graph model. I suspect that what we're going to support at the enterprise level is everything's going to reside in a graph. So the enterprise course catalog, the enterprise learner record repository, and likely many of the competency frameworks. We have long thought that the competency frameworks need to be in a directed acyclic graph. But for local catalogs and for local learner profiles, we will likely be pushing out relational databases as well that support that, so that people who are implementing this can choose either or. But what you'll note from this and looking at the graph, it's just so much more visually aesthetic, and it makes it understandable, right? So everything in the blue is this core here that we know that we need, the provenance, who's paying for the course, who's publishing it, who built it. In the pink here, we kind of ticked out all these different types of profiles. And so we might have an activity profile that describes a field trip or a lab or other types of experiences, learning experiences. So we are kind of working in courses right now because that's the name of the catalog. It's the Enterprise Course Catalog. And we are building out courses and collecting metadata about courses from a lot of different stakeholders. But we had conversations, a lot of them, about creating a conference profile. I mean, I don't know about you. I learn when I go to conferences. I read the papers. I understand that. And if I can show that I've done it, I'd like to know about it, or at least get credit for it in some way, shape, or form. Certainly simulations. This is an awesome example, right? A webinar of sorts, or maybe there's an xAPI party profile. But if you can describe this, now you know the value that you're getting. And then you're aligning that to the different competencies that you're starting to teach. So if we were to have a learning engineering track, this should show up underneath learning engineering in some way, shape, or form. If I do a search on xAPI or learning engineering or wherever inside of the Enterprise Course Catalog, we would want this to show up, right? I think that makes sense to me. The more we can get people smarter about what we're doing, the better. And so really the ECC is just about exposing these opportunities to folks. Competencies. I don't have much to say about that. I will say that they are kind of the brokerage service to communicate with other systems. We often look at competencies as what you need to do, the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other behaviors needed to perform your mission and to meet your mission objective. And so it's a very operational definition, right? We want to know the competencies that you need to, what do you need to do your job? But by understanding that and quantifying that and building that into a framework, we can start to map all your training and education experiences, but we can also map all of your previous deployment or your previous job experiences and other things to this as well. And so I think there's a lot to be said for that. This is kind of the structure of what's going on with IEEE over here on the right. We talked a little bit earlier about this rubric and the need to have localized task conditions and standards. Can't stress that enough, but then that puts the onus on the registry to be able to provide those alignment tools so that I can understand the context of your previous training and how you were assessed. But this isn't a standalone standard, right? So we're also using the credential transparency description language to point to these SCDs. So if you think about what Credential Engine has done, they've broken all these credentials down into the competencies that those credentials represent. But then T3 Innovation Network is working with the Job Data Exchange standard to do the same thing for position descriptions. Credential Engine has their career pathways. So now you're linking all these competencies to career milestones and the knowledge, skills, abilities I need to get to this level, to this level, to this level. So when we think about those career field managers, these are the types of tools that we're going to be able to use to connect all the dots. And there's a whole lineage here now because you're lining your tactical raw learner performance data using xAPI from a single learning activity all the way up to careers and these career milestones. And once you have the scope and breadth of all that data, you can start to do the longitudinal analysis and you can do the optimization. And so when I think of adaptive instructional systems, I'm not thinking of adaptive learning activities as much as I am about how do we get someone from a novice to an expert as quickly as possible. How do we accelerate that so that they can get up to speed quicker? I think that's about all I have to say for that one. Learner profile. I will point out, Andy is the chair of the working group for P2881. I think that's important to note. I'm the chair of the P2997, and that's going to kick off in January. The PAR was passed a few months ago, and I've been really remiss in getting that kicked off, mainly because of workload. But I think also from timing, we just want to be able to close out the old year and get started with the new year, and then we're going to hit the ground running. I'm trying to build out the roadmap and get a few more artifacts done so that we can walk through all that. But this is one of the neatest things that I've ever had the opportunity to be involved with. So we talked about the MOM statements, right? So the MOM ties all of Judy's learning activities together with the competencies that have been conferred to her. But it also looks at all of her previous employment information and the jobs that you've had and whatnot. The reality is that when you're on a job for any period of time, you're learning things. And so we're always very careful to say that when we're talking about defining competencies, or not defining competencies, but predicting competency and proficiency, that they're all predictive. It's like, I think Robbie always says, they're like free throws, right? You know, you can have a 98% free throw rating and you still have no idea whether you're going to make the next free throw. There's a good chance you're gonna, but you can't guarantee it. And so all of this data here is really meant to pull that to more accurate synopsis of each individual, both within an organization from a management perspective. So if you're doing workforce planning or mission planning in the DoD's context, you might use some of this information here. But we also want this to be relevant to all the other training applications that are out there so that I can have a better snapshot of who am I teaching and what do I need to do to adapt that. We are running this through operational testing right now. NETSI and their My Navy Learning program is implementing all of the TLA standards, and they're doing a wonderful job. I'm so impressed and so fortunate that our team gets to work with them on an almost weekly basis. The Army Synthetic Training Environment team is doing the same thing. Matter of fact, we showed a full-out demo just with a giant simulator with like 6 big screens down there at ITSEC last week, and actually had the Chief Data Officers group there to see it. It was a hit. It was just a really good demo. They really did a good job of implementing and compartmentalizing the TLA standards inside the simulators. And there's so much synergy there. Now we're doing like these every other working groups between the Navy and the Army, and talking about getting CAS accredited and pushing it into an environment so that the Navy investment, the Army investment, and the ADL investment can all be realized in the context of number 5 here, this learning technology warehouse, so that any other organization that wants to download it and run it and use competencies for their own, they can do that. So this slide is important to us. The biggest thing we've got going is this USASOC training right now for the Civil Affairs team. This is we're having everything stood up in the IL4. We're hooking up a whole bunch of activities. This is the tip of the iceberg. We're putting in the data management infrastructure, the schema server, linked data that helps us semantically and syntactically interpret the data that's being collected, especially about competencies. The conversation we had last night was, tank. It's a whole different ballgame if you're talking about a tank for Army folks versus Navy folks versus Air Force or scuba divers. It's just, so having linked data is going to be really important for that. And then these learning activities, we are building out this concept of a TLA core, but I got to be careful with that. This is just a starter kit. We are building out our 4 data buckets, and we're hooking Kafka into it, and a web portal that's going to have a bunch of canned, dashboards and a registration system, so that people can pilot test using this TLA core. We're hoping that people can pick this off and really start beefing it up, and so that it no longer needs a ADL TLA core. This then becomes kind of like the old SCORM sample runtime environment, or our sample LRS. I have no doubt that industry is going to be able to take the ball and run with this a lot further and faster than what we can do, because we're balancing a lot of these other things going on, right? So this is kind of the big picture vision of what the DoD Learning Enclave will be. You'll have all these things sitting in Learning Technology Warehouse. If you want it, you can automatically deploy it, work out the assisted acquisition and whatnot. This is already being done in large part over by USA Learning, but that the requirements that USA Learning is willing to meet are not the requirements that the DoD needs. DISA made it very clear. There's some discussion by people much smarter and senior than I am. And so now they've decided to move over and do it all as a DoD type of thing. And that's what we're moving forward. That's why we're going into Platform 1 and doing all this. I would point out that with the Learning Technology Warehouse, we're very adamant about making sure that you can deploy it in the DLE, but you can deploy it on-prem, you can deploy it on your own networks, you can deploy it into an embedded system if you want. We will have a bunch of hardened containers that are sitting in Iron Bank, and then you can demo the systems running in the LTW so that you can see You can compare, the Yet Analytics LRS, the Veracity LRS, and the the Learning Locker LRS, and see, what are the differences here. Same thing with LMSs and other tools in there. And eventually, we'll have this whole ecosystem of compliant and conformant and accredited tools that people can, in theory, download and run. And we have literally one button deployment script set up to run them in Azure or in Amazon right now. And this is kind of what that gets to. So you'll have the TLA core with everything talking to it. And that kind of goes back to the big picture that we talked about with those this whole idea of the fabric here. We want to be able to have the seamless ups and downs. And I think that I will give us about 4 minutes for questions. But I'm not really hearing anything, and I'm not seeing anything. Let me see. Can this eliminate redundant courses? We sure hope so. So I see it as two things. I see the experience index is kind of the enterprise course catalog and its component, the experience index, almost as like a Trojan horse. Initially, our key performance metrics are, eliminating redundant courses. We didn't find a whole lot of redundant courses. We found a lot of redundant ELOs inside those courses, though. And so there will be some cost savings by doing that. But when I say it's a Trojan horse, it's also a way of just getting an inventory of all your available resources. And when we talk about wanting to have that server-side implementation, we've been calling it the Activity and Resource Management API, the ARM API. Because if you think about the possibilities when we're moving above and beyond just online learning and thinking about scheduling simulator time, and you got to have role players, and you got to have these power considerations, or these other observer controllers. There's a lot of other resources that are needed for some of these learning events, and so we want to make sure that we're able to connect into the other functional areas of the DoD. Hence the reason we're going to this graph model. It's all part of the bigger data strategy. Oh, I see. You answered your own question. Let me see what else we got here. It looks like I don't have any other questions. I can't believe that to be the case. But I did feel like I rambled for about 50 minutes. So yes, sir. All of the things that we do are open source. And so all of the hardened stuff that's sitting inside of the IL4 and that will be inside of the LTW will be CAC accessible. So you need a common access card to get to. But what we're doing right now is we're taking all sorts of open source tools and putting in there. My expectation and my humble belief is that sooner rather than later, we want to start having conversations with commercial firms to figure out how do we get commercial tools in there as well. I don't think it's fair to just say that we're going to use open source for everything. But that's the easiest for us to do right now, because we can get in and change things and refactor the code as we need to, so that we can work up, through all the wickets and getting these initial things set up. As time progresses, though, certainly getting commercial systems in there is going to be important. If you are interested and you have a DoD customer, feel free to reach out to myself or Andy, and we'll put you in contact with the right people. And we are putting together an IPT to look at reciprocity. So all the work that we're doing to accredit these systems, how can we make sure that they're available for the Navy, for the Air Force, for the Army, and for the Fourth Estate to be able to use as well? That's not a given right now. There's still a lot of issues and hurdles we have to jump through. But we're going to put a team together to try to make all that happen. So, well, if there are no other questions, I will go ahead and stop sharing and sign off and let you all go about your day. And I'll see you in the next session. Thanks.